So, good morning. Less than 3 hours ago, the United States government raised tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese exports. Yesterday, the Chinese spokesman of the foreign ministry there said that they would retaliate against American tariff increases, but not one for one. Overnight, we learned from the Citigroup economics team that the tariff increases that we are seeing here today will reduce Chinese growth by 0.5% of GDP, and they will also expand to a 1% reduction in GDP growth if the trade war expands to include all of Chinese exports, as Donald Trump has threatened. Ladies and gentlemen, then the trade wars, the tariff wars that we have been discussing are very much in the news and in the headlines, and you might be forgiven for thinking that when it comes to trade policy, this is the largest elephant in the room. I'm here to tell you that that is not true. I'm going to base my findings on the Global Trade Alert report, the 24th report, which I co-authored with Johannes Fritz. This is work that we undertake here at St. Gallen. What makes our work distinctive is precisely because we base our analysis on a forensic collection of data about what governments are doing around the world with respect to trade liberalization and trade protectionism. We've documented over 20,000 interventions by governments. The IMF in 2016 said we had the most comprehensive coverage, and our coverage has doubled since then. The World Trade Organization's trade monitoring database has 4,766 entries. In addition to putting the Sino-US trade war into perspective, I will also build a bridge to the next session, the panel's discussion about making the case for trade. And I will put forward some proposals for how we can make a new case for a liberal trading order. Let us start then with the classic framing of the trade war, which I show in this particular chart here. The way the trade war is normally framed is in terms of the tariff increases of 2018, which are shown in the left two columns, which add up to just under $400 billion of Sino-US trade. If you then add on top of that the Trump tariff threats of last Sunday, then you can see that almost all of Sino-US trade would be influenced or affected by the trade war if those threats come to pass. The gap, by the way, is made up with the little amount of US exports which have yet to be hit by China. Now, this characterization is unfortunately misleading in three respects. First, it only focuses on tariffs. Secondly, it gives you the impression that before 2018 everything was fine. Notice that all the data starts in 2018. And thirdly, it relates to a bilateral trading relationship which is large, but still accounts for less than 5% of world trade, and there's lots of other action going on in the rest of the world. So I want to go through each of these 3 points and then draw out their implications. The first point to say, and this relates to the turquoise bar in the middle of this particular chart, is that last year America and China took action against the others' exports using lots of non-targeted measures, not necessarily tariffs, they could be other forms of trade policy. And if you add them up, it turns out that they covered $101 billion of trade as well. So in total then, the trade war that we saw last year was not a $350 billion affair, it was a $450 billion affair. It was actually larger than has often been reported. Now you can see then that when you add in this additional information, you get a better sense of the scale of this particular trade war. So tariffs are not the only game in town as far as protectionism is concerned, a theme which we'll come back to. The second thing which is unfortunate about this chart is that it doesn't tell you how much additional protectionism we're seeing in 2018 is compared to the protectionism that was already in place before the trade war begins. To look at that, let's look at this particular chart here, which shows Chinese exports to the United States. And here there are 2 points to be made. First, before the trade war began in 2017, over $300 billion of Chinese exports already faced trade distortions or trade measures in the United States, which had been taken by Washington and the state governments. So 30% of Chinese trade before the trade war actually entered the United States freely. 70%, or in fact 69.1%, was already facing trade distortions. When the trade war hits, that percentage rises to 87%, but you can see that the increase in the amount of Chinese goods which are facing trade distortions for the first time is much smaller than the headlines that you would have gathered from the previous chart. And so in that sense, the trade war looks a little bit smaller. Another implication of this particular chart is, suppose you're sitting in Beijing and you're thinking about your negotiating objectives. Getting rid of the trade war, tariffs would only take us back to 2017. So the amount of Chinese trade which faces trade distortions in the US would fall from 87% back to 69%. So in other words, there's still a lot of protectionism there, which would still have to be unwound. This gives you a sense then that the trade war is important, but when seen compared to the installed base of protectionism in the United States, you can see that, in fact, the Chinese face plenty of obstacles in the US. Yesterday, the American president said, "We have not collected 10 cents on China's exports." I beg to differ. This chart suggests to the contrary. Okay? Now let's turn this around and look at US exports to China. Well, US exports to China, interestingly, about 2/3 of them have faced trade distortions or barriers in the Chinese markets as well before the crisis hit. And then once the trade war hits, the percentage jumps to 92%. Or to put it differently, now only 8% of US exports to China enter the Chinese market without any form of trade impediment. So here you can see the impact of the tariff increases last year. It's there, but again, of course, it builds on an already large base of Chinese protectionism. The second point to make in this chart really relates to the difference between 2018 and 2019. After President Trump and Xi had their nice dinner in Buenos Aires in December, the Chinese announced that they would not put in place the tariffs they had said they would increase on auto parts. And this was seen as being the first victory of the American campaign against Chinese trade distortions. The Chinese implemented those measures on the 1st of January, and you can see what the impact is on the total amount of goods which enter China freely. It fell from 92.1% to 91.8%. In other words, by very, very little. So what's actually gone on here is that the Chinese offered to take off tariffs on auto parts, which are very high profile in American politics, but it turns out that those auto parts already face 4 or 5 other trade distortions in the Chinese market anyway. So they're already being held back by other things. And this gives you a sense of the smoke and mirrors which takes place in trade politics. And it might also give you a sense as to why the Americans feel like they have not got much out of the Chinese in these negotiations, and why they've taken such a hard line in the last week or so. What this chart and the last chart shows you really is that we need to review the trade war in the context of the installed base or the pre-existing protectionism which is there. And when we do that, we find out the trade war is a lot smaller in relative terms than you might have thought from the headlines. And that is, of course, because there has been this accumulation of protectionism over time, over the last 10 years, which we have documented. And to show you that, I want to turn to the next chart. Now, one of the things about 2018, and I think the reason we all got so excited about the trade wars, was because of the large numbers involved, hitting $100 billion, $200 billion worth of trade. And so there was an implicit distinction between sort of jumbo protectionist measures, very, very large ones, and the small fry that we see from day to day. Well, in order to help reveal the importance of what we saw last year compared to earlier years, we went into our database and tried to find every single trade distortion which affected more than $10 billion of exports anywhere in the world. And we found, since 2008, November 2008, we found 348 instances of such jumbo protectionism. The trade wars which Donald Trump has undertaken since coming to office are just 6 of them. 4 relate to the Sino-US trade war. So that suggests that there's a huge number of other very large protectionist measures or trade distorting measures which have been introduced, which have been under the radar screen. And that's what leads to this title here, that covert, hidden protectionism is what has been going on. Most governments have wanted to favor their local firms or favor exports, but they don't want the headlines that Donald Trump wants. They do it quietly. Or, to put it differently, the difference between the protectionism before Trump was that it was covert and hidden, and Trump has made it overt. Okay, and that is, I think, the important difference there. Now, you might say to me, well, Simon, 10 billion isn't very much compared to this 200 billion you mentioned earlier. Well, I should tell you that in our database, we have found, we're using very fine-grained trade data, that there are 28 instances where governments have put in place measures which have distorted over $500 billion, $500 billion worth of trade. If Donald Trump follows through with all of his threats, he will not, his threats to the Chinese, if executed, won't even get into the top 25 largest protectionist measures of the last 10 years, right? The action is elsewhere, okay? The action is elsewhere. And I think this is a very important point for those of us who want to defend the world trading system, because it hasn't been doing so well. Okay? The idea that the system was doing well up until 2018, until this rogue occupant of the White House took control, is, I think, the wrong impression. You can see here there's a lot of jumbo protectionism which has been taking place before then. And so this gives you a sense, when seen from the appropriate intertemporal or decadal perspective, the trade wars here are just a continuation of a lot of protectionism that has been building up over time. Now let's relate these sort of actions to what's going on the ground for various exporters. Now we have distinguished guests here from Botswana and from Singapore visiting us at the symposium. And so I asked the team recently to estimate what is the percentage of the exports that Botswana's exporters, or what is the percentage of Botswana's exporters that face trade distortions abroad and that Singapore's exporters face abroad? And we start the clock at November 2008 and then count up the protectionist measures which harm these different countries and then find out how much trade is implicated there. So what's the share of Botswana's trade that is exports that are affected by protectionism year by year? And if a piece of foreign protectionism drops out, we take that out of the data. Right? We only count what's going on in the year in question. And what you can see here is that Botswana sees a massive jump in the amount of its exports which face foreign trade distortions when the crisis hits in 2009. And this was a whole series of tariff changes and also incentives given by some governments to export goods, which Botswana also exports. Okay? And so this gives you a sense then of the hit which the exporters in Botswana would have taken. And standing behind this, of course, please recognize our people. You know, these are exporting firms. They employ staff. Those staff have salaries. Those salaries pay for their families. And so there's a real human side to what seems like dry numbers. The numbers for Singapore are a bit more common. Most countries don't see this massive spike like Botswana, but for Singapore we see this progressive increase in the amount of its exports which face foreign trade distortions. Well over 80% now of Singapore's exports face trade distortions in 2019, which have been implemented over the last decade, but which are still in effect now. And this pattern that we see for Singapore actually is replicated for the world, but to a slightly less degree. In fact, what we've seen is that by now, 3/4 of world trade faces at least one trade distortion in overseas markets. And we've even dug deeper into this to find out how many trade distortions they face, and the numbers are accumulating over time, building up. More and more trade is facing more and more trade distortions. So this is a trading system which is underperforming substantially, and it has been underperforming well before Donald Trump ever came to office, and certainly well before the trade war happened. Now, in the light of this, how do we interpret this? And I think there's a bit of a warning for those of us who are defenders of the world trading system and of a liberal trading order, and I count myself amongst them. One of the things that the critics have been saying, and I've cited two of them here, is that trade wars have been going on for a long period of time. That trade wars have been, or at least trade protectionism and trade distortion is much more extensive. Now, of course, these critics want to use that fact to justify their own trade protectionism, right? But they have a point about the first step in their argument. There has been much more trade distortions than many people realize or many people appreciate. And every time we stand up and say the system was great until Donald Trump came along, we lose credibility with this audience. Because for them and for many industrialists and firms who make such complaints, and I've heard such complaints from German firms, Austrian firms, and Swiss firms in the last 12 months, for them, if we can't accept or acknowledge the fact that they're facing more difficulties abroad, then we seem out of touch. Okay? And I think what we have to do is to then come up with a case for a liberal trading order which recognizes the fact, starts off from the fact that we have a problem. And that's ultimately where I want to go with this. So the first point I would like to make is that we need to stop saying that the trading system's doing a great job. It isn't. Okay, the current set of rules are not enough. They do not address many of the subsidies that governments are giving firms. They do not address many of the non-tariff barriers which are impeding trade. So the system needs to be improved. The starting point is we have a problem. The second thing we need to be doing is to, given that there has been so much protectionism and trade distortions going on, we should be pointing out how much this policy fails to deliver on what it promises. It fails to deliver on job growth. It fails to deliver on investment. If anything, trade policy uncertainty deters investment. The other thing we're seeing, so much of the trade distortions these days are subsidies, and these cost money, and this adds to the concerns that organizations like the IMF have, and furthermore, protectionism by distracting politicians results in lost opportunities to liberalize and also for firms to break into new markets. So we must keep reiterating that protectionism is the wrong path to go. And we must also go a step further, since people like Secretary Ross and others use everyone else's protectionism to justify their own. We need to argue that retaliation is the flawed response. It may be tempting politically, but it is the flawed response. We need to remember what Gandhi said: an eye for an eye ends up making the whole world blind. And this is very much, I think, the line we should take. We do not want to see retaliation. Instead, we need to make a positive case, and this is where I turn to the last 2 points. In the positive case we want to make is that governments can develop local industries, they can develop supply chains, they can develop their economies, but they do not necessarily need to resort to the type of blatant protectionism and subtle protectionism that we've seen. We have very good work what we've seen done by international organizations showing how partnerships between multinational firms and local firms can help build up domestic productive capacity, and we need to highlight those as serious alternatives. It is intriguing that some of the best examples for this come from Latin America, in countries like Chile, who tried the protectionist route first and then realized that it wasn't working and had to find an alternative. So we need a positive message on how governments can develop their own economies and their firms in their economy, which does not rely on protectionism. And lastly, we need to start rebuilding the world trading system and the support for it amongst governments. Now, I know this is a very difficult thing to do, and there's no appetite amongst countries for another global trade round. However, there are enough supporters of global trade and of freer trade around the world to be able to think that we could move ahead in coalitions. And these coalitions could then translate into what we call plurilateral accords at the World Trade Organization. That's a fancy word for groups of countries moving faster ahead together. And one of the things we do in the 24th Global Trade Alert Report is to actually go through sector by sector, policy instrument by policy instrument, where we think these coalitions can be built. And to be honest, it's a bit surprising that that type of analysis hasn't been done to date. And in the report, when it's published, you'll be able to see what our findings are, where we think progress can be made in the shorter term. So overall then, I think the message going forward is we have to recognize reality, we have to keep pushing back against protectionism and retaliation, and we have to develop positive messages at home for governments who want to be active in supporting their own economy's development. And lastly, we need to rebuild the coalition at the global level in favor of different aspects of liberalizing trade. And we may not be able to do that with all countries together at the moment, but we can certainly build momentum amongst coalitions of the willing, to coin a phrase. Thank you very much.